Okay, this is episode 1 of 2 for Tuesday. We're picking up with our 1960s PowerPoint, and this is the 1960s Why Protest. We discussed this in class the other day. It would seem that the 60s would be a time when you would not see a whole lot of protests because the economy was growing very, very well. All kinds of new inventions, all kinds of new frontiers, as Kennedy had called it. So let's get to why the protest occurs. And we'll start with the idea that the oldest of the baby boomers turn 18 to 20 with Kennedy's election. And there is optimism and idealism that peak, in a sense you could say, with his statement, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country." The Peace Corps would be a prototype of something that the younger generation believed was part of what Kennedy had brought with him, and something that was a very good symbol of the idea that they could change the world and change it much for the better. Peace Corps being a volunteer organization that you would volunteer to do work overseas for a year, 2 years, 3 years after high school rather than entering college right away, or after college rather than entering the workforce right away. But with the assassination, some of these dreams seem to sour, as we talked the other day. If there is a turning point between the idealism of the early 1960s and then the beginning of the protest, you could use the Kennedy assassination as sort of a dividing line. College students are a big part of the protest, and as some critics say, they are enjoying a form of extended adolescence by not getting into the workforce and not having jobs in a way that in the past many people their age could not do, because they generally had to work right away. But because more people are in college and taking a longer time to be in college, the college students are the basis for the original anti-war protests that we'll see. But their protest, even though we'll discuss them in great detail, really fell in line behind the original protest movement, which was the civil rights movement that began in the 1950s. So we talked a little bit about this in class last week, but this is the list of the events, and we'll go through them very quickly. 1954, the Supreme Court rules that segregation in education is no longer legal in the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And in 1955, Rosa Parks takes an action that begins a nonviolent protest and boycott of the Montgomery, Alabama bus system. And this idea that the boycott was ultimately successful in forcing the system to allow for the integration of the buses is a prototype for what people will use from that point forward. Nonviolent, sometimes boycotting economically, but not doing anything to cause any trouble if possible. 1957, the Little Rock High School scenario that we watched in the video. 1960, the Greensboro, North Carolina lunch counters. We talked a little bit about that. The marches that begin around this time are backed by the Supreme Court, saying that the people have the right to march. And what you'll find is that there are people who come from the north into the south, where most of the segregation is being attacked, and they are called civil rights workers. Now, civil rights workers were generally Anglo, and they tended to be from the northern states, and they were usually college age or close to it, and very idealistic. So they came into the South to help try and make a change. An example of this occurred with the Freedom Riders in 1961. You see the picture on the bottom right. The Freedom Riders were a group of people who rented buses and then traveled from city to city in the South. And when they arrived, they purposely violated the rules about the waiting room for the buses, where the black passengers on the bus would get off and go into the whites-only waiting room, and the white passengers on the buses would go into the blacks-only waiting room, or the segregated room. Eventually, and this is the picture that you see here, these buses, as they're going across the South, are actually attacked on the highway. One of them is firebombed, as you see here, and people are injured. But the Freedom Riders, as they were known, were also making a point by purposely violating the law. Most of the time, as they would arrive in a city, they would be immediately arrested, but ultimately, or usually, let go. 1962, James Meredith goes through quite a bit of difficulty becoming the first black student at the University of Mississippi. As we mentioned the other day, the rioting around that by those segregationists and actually attacking the media, and a couple of marshals who were working for the federal government will actually cause 4 deaths in that situation, and quite a large riot at the University of Mississippi. But James Meredith will finally be admitted because Kennedy will send the military in to make sure it happens, much like Eisenhower had sent the military into Little Rock to make sure that the busing order or the desegregation order was followed. It's also the case that in 1962 Malcolm X makes the statement that the change that needs to occur by any means necessary. Now, he's a leader of a kind of an opposing group to King. Malcolm X and ultimately the Nation of Islam, as it's called, which he was part of at one point, are going to argue that the change that King was trying to bring about is the right idea, but the idea itself was taking much too long. And their notion was that King would never really get anywhere with nonviolence, that any means necessary should be used in order to make the change that has to occur. And in fact, the Nation of Islam will actually begin to push very hard for separatism. Their argument was that some portion of the United States should be given to African Americans as a payment for slavery, and also because the white population would never actually integrate. This brings to sort of a head the differences between King and the more violent side of the civil rights protest movement, which continues the theme that we talked about earlier, that you could see begin between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. And then the first time that there was a major separatist push was by Marcus Garvey back in the 1920s. But you put those things together and you get Malcolm X first, and as we'll see, the Black Panthers later. In 1963, in a peaceful march in Birmingham, Alabama, protesting the lack of voting rights and segregation, these other 2 pictures that you see here on the bottom took place. On the left, you see that peaceful protesters or peaceful marchers are attacked by police dogs, and in the middle you see peaceful protesters who are being hit with high-pressure fire hoses. All of this was on TV, and as I said in class the other day, one of the goals of nonviolent protest is to really kind of irritate those who are against you to the point where they have to turn to violence to make their point, since they don't really have a logical leg to stand on in the case of trying to support segregation. And so Bull Connor, the sheriff of Birmingham, Alabama, became a very notorious figure, and these events are some of those that pushed the country into trying to create legislation to try and end segregation. 1963, during a protest in Birmingham, Martin Luther King is put in jail, and he writes a very famous letter from the jail that explains what he's all about and what he's attempting to achieve. It's a historical document today that's considered to be one of the best ways you can actually look at the entire movement. He is released, and in the summer of 1963, he will go to Washington, D.C., and 500,000 other people will march there for a giant rally to try and convince Congress to pass civil rights legislation. And it's at that time, in front of the Lincoln Memorial, that he will give the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. JFK was a supporter of civil rights, although he had to be very careful, once again, just as we talked about before, still trying not to alienate the Democratic South, and also really planning, according to many historians, to do more to push civil rights in his second term if he was elected. But of course, unfortunately, he was assassinated in November of '63. Now, in '64, the revolt by African Americans moves north. A couple of things that were probably part of it: the failure to pass civil rights legislation initially. Bored, unemployed urban black residents are angered over conditions and a lack of response by the government. These things are brought together by mass communication, and violence will begin. Some of the most notorious riots, a suburb or a part of L.A. that was very impoverished, called Watts, in 1965, a huge riot that lasted for a couple of weeks, 35 killed, 600 buildings destroyed. a later report by a commission put together by Congress called the Kerner Commission will talk all about this riot, because it was very perplexing to many people. Why would people burn their own area of town? And it seems to be something that's very consistent. The Rodney King riots in 1992, which were a result of the police officers who had stopped a black motorist by the name of Rodney King being acquitted of any kind of charges. He was beaten, and it was on video, but they were acquitted of any charges, and the result was a massive riot, which is actually the largest loss of property in the history of rioting of the United States. But it was the same scenario. Most of the stuff that was burned, most of the stuff that was looted or destroyed, were places where African Americans actually resided. We actually saw this recently in the situation in Baltimore. So it was very perplexing to Mr. and Mrs. White middle-class America as to how something like this could happen, and why would they burn their own portion of town. Ultimately, people believe it was the frustration that they were facing, and as we'll see, this is going to spread to many cities up in the north. Now, the Republicans capitalize on this, as the Democrats are blamed for being in charge during the violence, and it seemed that every summer cities would burn. Republicans begin to run on a law and order platform or campaign. Nixon definitely does this in 1968, and the other thing the Republicans do is they begin what they call the Southern Strategy, as the Solid South begins to crack, and they begin to look to the Republicans as the party that may actually be able to help them more. The change to the South voting Republican really very consistently is complete by 1980, and you can see it in this map, which is actually the election of Ronald Reagan over Jimmy Carter in 1980. So the South will become solidly Republican, and in fact the North will become more Democrat, really reflecting a difference between urban and rural viewpoints as much as anything else. So from 64 to 68, nonviolence tends to be thrown aside. Younger African Americans think nonviolence is too slow. They admire King, but they really believe change needs to happen much faster. There are massive riots in cities like Detroit in 67. In fact, they burn much of the center portion of the city down, and eventually that turns into what's called the Renaissance area of Detroit, which was a renaissance at one point, although it's not quite as new today as it once was. Newark, New Jersey has massive riots and fires, and much of the city is burned up. There are riots in more than 100 cities in 1967. There are actually some bombings and actually attack of the police and even firemen in a form of guerrilla warfare. The other thing you'll see is the beginning of a very loud movement that pushed the notion of black power. Burn, baby, burn, they said, as the towns were burning. Move on over, or we'll move on over you. And this was illustrated very well by a group that formed in 1968 in L.A. called the Black Panthers, which actually was dedicated to the use of violence, if necessary, to get the changes that they want. White Americans outside the South quickly changed their view. Originally, they had thought that segregation and all the problems they had seen on TV were just a Southern problem, but now it becomes something that has spread across the United States. And the pinnacle of this in some ways is the April 4th, 1968 assassination of Martin Luther King in Memphis, and there are riots in at least 100 cities as a result of that. The movement itself will begin to fade and actually end by the early 70s, and as you can see here, all of the protest movements fade by the early 70s. Civil rights movement fades as the general consensus emerges that outward racism is unacceptable. Now, this would be about 73, 74. Nixon adds affirmative action, and the move towards equality begins. And federally mandated desegregation leads to busing and white flight, which is something that hits many cities. In fact, one of the things that happens in Dallas is that people will move to the suburbs or send their children to private schools like Ursuline as a result of the desegregation order by the federal government. And when that happens, a massive proportion of the white school population in DISD just disappears, either going to the suburbs or ending up in private schools. That's called white flight. Not only will the parents, of course, put their kids elsewhere, but they will move to the suburbs. This causes the cities to lose more tax base, even pushing poverty even further. But what can we say overall? We'll pick up on the next episode.